At 7 o'clock, with the latest for London, this is Stephen Davies. An amber weather warning has come into force across much of England as the UK braces itself for record high temperatures over the coming days.
I remember walking across Canary Wharf and the sun on the back of my neck, thinking, oh gosh, it's hot already.
Temperatures could hit more than 40 Celsius, triggering a severe red warning for the first time.
Describe a bit how you were feeling.
Really frightened, really anxious, really anxious.
On this sweltering hot morning in July 2022, Maggie, a dementia nurse in her 50s, is crossing the Thames and heading towards the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf.
On any moment you think you're going to be stopped.
She's carrying a glass punch. It's a tool used for breaking heavy-duty glass.
And you push into it, and it goes ping, ping, and it kind of bangs into the glass.
Maggie approaches the offices of multinational investment bank JP Morgan. It's a 33-storey building overlooking the river.
So I'm there putting a similar force through it that I would if I was resuscitating somebody. You know, that force which is enough but not too much. It's just like, keep going. Compress, 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 compress to the theme tune of the Archers. Compress, compress, compress.
Eventually, the glass cracks.
Then when it did go to plan, that was excellent. That was right, good, okay, I've done this. I can sit down now, and I've done my job.
Maggie's not on her own. She's with 5 others, another nurse and 4 doctors. Between the 6 medics, they break 8 windows, causing nearly £200,000 worth of damage.
The police arrived. We were sat down. There was a lot of police turned up.
I've seen the footage of this moment from the police officer's body-worn camera. It's a surreal sight. The glass of the skyscraper is gleaming in the sun, and in front of it, 6 people are sitting on the floor dressed in scrubs. You can see Maggie looking up at the police officer. She tells him that she's a nurse and she's concerned about the level 4 heatwave and the risk it poses to the population. She says that JP Morgan is the biggest funder of fossil fuels and that this is the first time that she's broken the law. The protesters are handcuffed and taken to the police station, where they're charged with criminal damage. Nearly 2 years later, we're following Maggie and the 5 other medics as they defend their action in court. The stakes couldn't be higher. If found guilty, they could be jailed, and it might mean the end of their medical careers.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
They're part of an environmental movement whose tactics are controversial. Blocking roads, people gluing themselves to government departments, and most recently throwing orange powder over Stonehenge.
Just stop oil! Just stop oil! Just stop oil! Just stop oil!
These climate activists are heroes to some, but to others they're at best a nuisance, and at worst extremists.
It is a dangerous ladder of potential extremism, because if you accept the idea that it's okay or justifiable to break the law in favour of particular causes, where does that stop?
In response, new protest laws have been introduced. There are more severe punishments and tougher treatment in the courts, leading some to question if the freedom to protest is now under threat.
It's a very hostile climate for protesting at the minute. It's as hostile as possibly it's ever been.
I am outside Snaresbrook Crown Court, which is quite far into northeast London, and it's a big, imposing sandstone building. Looks a bit like a church. But to the side of that is a 1960s prefab type building, which is a little bit less impressive. Looks kind of like somewhere you might have had your GCSE science lesson. And this is where the case of the 6 medics is taking place. Alongside Maggie is GP Patrick Hart, psychiatrist Juliette Brown, consultant obstetrician Alex Clack, retired GP David McKelvey, and nurse Ali Rowe. Many of them have taken unpaid leave from work to attend the court case, and their thoughts already going to what might happen if they're found guilty. The General Medical Council suspended a doctor earlier this year because of a protest offence.
If we're found guilty, then that would change my nursing career. And that's a job I love immensely. I've been a nurse for 25 years. For me, the possibility of losing that as a profession, as a job that I love, is huge, and I can't think about that because the grief would be awful.
This is the first time Maggie has ever been in court, the first time she's ever been arrested. She says she never even got a detention at school, let alone risk breaking the law. But this began to change in 2018, when she started reading more about climate change and attended meetings organised by protest group Extinction Rebellion.
And I was really joining the dots up super fast, really, really quickly.
How did you feel in that period when you were doing all this reading and, like you say, joining the dots?
Sad. Really sad, but also getting a sense of power, of a voice, of finding my tribe.
She joined Health for Extinction Rebellion, a group of healthcare workers concerned about the impacts of climate change on people's health. And they started to zero in on a target for their action, JP Morgan.
With JP Morgan, they were so big, and it was so obvious what they were doing. It was funding fossil fuels.
Maggie and the others handed out leaflets, wrote to the management and organised a protest outside the doors.
We're clearly not getting anywhere. Like, okay, this is getting urgent. And then you hear news that we're going to hit the first level 4 heat wave. And I got that news in a week where I was visiting a patient living with dementia on her own. Her favourite place is a conservatory. So my code of conduct, it says, if you see a threat to public health, if you see that somebody's going to be harmed, you have to act.
Was there a moment in which you took the decision that you were going to take this action?
Yeah, it was thinking about the lady in the conservatory. And it's just that image of her glass and this heat coming down on her and hoping she was all right. And then the image of the glass in JP Morgan. And it's just like, I can't leave this be.
How would you respond to somebody who said that, even if they agree with your cause, that there's no justification for damaging someone else's property?
So I think in terms of the benefit and the harm, the benefit of what we did outweighed the harm. So in terms of JP Morgan's profits, we worked out it cost them 3.5 minutes worth of profits. That was the cost of our damage to JP Morgan. So I felt confident that they could absorb that cost.
JP Morgan told us that they're one of the leading financiers of clean energy as well as traditional energy, and that while they respect the legal right to peaceful protest, that does not extend to acts of criminal damage. The trial begins. First, it's the prosecution case. I have just been listening to the Crown Prosecution Service evidence, and it's pretty straightforward. They have CCTV showing the medics breaking the window, and it's clear that they did crack the window. They also don't deny that. So it feels really like the prosecution has an easy job on its hands at this point. The medics are part of a growing number of protesters going through the court system.
The volume has exponentially increased over the last few years. Started really with Extinction Rebellion, but that has continued.
Raj Chadha is a solicitor at Hodge Jones and Allen and one of the most experienced lawyers in the country when it comes to protest cases. He says his firm has seen a 13-fold increase in the number of protest inquiries that they received between 2018 and 2022. Previously, they were dealing with less than 100 a year. Now it's over 1,000.
There are different protest groups that are using different techniques. Without doubt, that is part of the equation. There is less tolerance by the state for protesting, particularly protests which may cause disruption. And so it's more likely that the police will arrest, and then it's more likely that the CPS will prosecute. The landscape has been completely transformed over the last few years. I've been doing this job for around 15 years in terms of specialising in protest work. Until 2019, I had never had a client imprisoned.
Do we have any idea how many people are in prison because of protest offences?
I think it's still dozens, it's not hundreds yet, but I think we're at the start of the curve because the new legislation is just coming through. And I suspect if you ask me that question in 6 to 12 months, you will find that there are a lot more people in prison.
New public order legislation has been introduced over the last 2 years with the aim of tackling the disruption caused by environmental protests.
For the first time actually in history, offences which mentioned the word protest and were specifically targeted within the legislation at protest. So things like locking on in a protest, interfering with national infrastructure, all new offences, all which could attract prison time.
Interference with national infrastructure is one of the new offences. It covers things like blocking roads and can come with a prison sentence. Last year, one protester was jailed for 6 months for attending a slow march. He was walking down a road in North London for just 30 minutes before he was arrested.
And overall, how would you characterise the climate for protesting at the moment?
It's a very hostile climate for protesting at the minute. It's as hostile as possibly it's ever been, and it's as dangerous in terms of threats to our civil liberties as it's ever been.
Hello, I'm here to see Lord Walney.
I'm in Westminster to meet John Woodcock, or Lord Walney. He's the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. He recently conducted a review into disruptive protests and believes that such tactics are not justified.
I think you have seen a level of disruption at times in the capital, which has been very significant. And if you are the victim of a roadblock and you're in an ambulance and it doesn't make it, well, the fact that it wasn't there the last couple of weekends doesn't reduce the seriousness of the impact of your life. There is no mandate for that. The public hate it. I think we've got to divorce the idea of there being some causes that are so important that it's okay to commit criminal damage in their name. It completely unacceptably short-circuits our democratic process. It massively inconveniences members of the public and can get a bill on businesses running into many millions of pounds.
Lord Walney thinks current legislation doesn't go far enough. His report recommends a range of new curbs on disruptive protest groups, such as restricting their ability to organise and fundraise and making it easier for businesses to claim damages, as well as creating protective buffer zones around energy sites. He describes activists who cause disruption and property damage as extreme. He's been criticised by activists who claim that he has a conflict of interest because he works with lobbying companies who also work with fossil fuel companies. He says that this does not affect his objectivity and that it's all a matter of public record.
I would think of extremism as being to do with hate, intolerance, violence.
Yeah.
Is extreme really the right word to describe people protesting against climate change?
Well, I think it's really important to divorce the cause for which you are undertaking actions, which can be noble, progressive, can command a great deal of support. You need to divorce that from the actions.
Some of the most impactful, some of the biggest democratic movements in history, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, have all used disruptive action. If we were sitting here in the early 20th century, would you be writing this review and calling them extremists?
No, I wouldn't. And the key word you use there is democratic movements, because the big difference with the suffragettes was that they didn't have the democratic agency to be part of shaping their own future, to have their say. And we are blessed now in this country. And we also have so many channels in which you can get your voice across to your fellow citizens, to your elected representatives. And people need to use those, not the violent extreme methods.
Oh, the banana bread's come out. Well found.
There's like vegan butter or peanut butter.
While the trial's taking place, Maggie and the others are staying in a house near the court, and it does feel like a strange reality TV show.
Take 6 people, stress them out, make them stand in front of a and live in a house together, and then they'll hate each other. But
Pat is a GP in his 30s. He's generally upbeat, but now and again, when the conversation turns to climate change, he gets a kind of haunted look in his eye.
I wouldn't have put myself in the category of some sort of nature-loving hippie type growing up.
He went on
in
his
my
first
20s.
Extinction Rebellion protest in 2018. He'd never been involved in activism before.
It felt deeply uncomfortable. I felt really awful, actually. I felt really anxious and awkward, hoping I wouldn't see anyone I knew.
Why do you think you felt uncomfortable?
Because most of my life I've been someone who doesn't challenge authority or who doesn't rock the boat. And I remember being asked myself if I'd like to be arrested, and I really thought, who is this lunatic? What's he talking about?
So, yeah, let's just gather together in this moment before we go into court, centering down and just feeling the earth beneath our feet. And as we've done every
Each morning before the trial begins, one of the medics, Dr. David McKelvey, a retired GP and Christian, gathers the group together before they head into court.
Let us recollect our sincere desire to protect all this for ourselves, for all living beings, and for generations to come.
OK, so it is day 3 of the trial, and the medics are starting to give their evidence. But they say they already feel at a disadvantage because they've been told by the judge that they'll not be able to use any legal defences. That's a way for them to try and justify their action in court and to potentially convince the jury that even though they broke the windows, they should be acquitted.
It felt like a real belly punch. That we have no defence in law, which seems, I don't know, it seems so wrong. And I guess to convince a jury, in some ways it's more difficult because it's an uphill task, but there's no legal reason for us not to be guilty.
Until recently, protesters were able to use various legal defences. For example, that they were exercising their right to free speech. And this had proved quite successful for some. You might remember protesters tearing down a statue of slave owner Edward Colston during a demonstration in Bristol. Well, in 2022, a jury found them not guilty of criminal damage. The protesters argued in court that a conviction would be a disproportionate interference with their right to protest. Some Conservative MPs were concerned about this verdict, so Suella Braverman, who was the Attorney General at the time, referred the case to the Court of Appeal to ask whether defendants could cite their human rights in criminal damage cases. The Court of Appeal ruled in her favour. So now, those accused of criminal damage, like the 6 medics, can no longer use human rights protections when on trial.
In protest cases, defences are continually being restricted at the minute by the higher courts.
Lawyer Raj Chadha again. You're not allowed to damage someone else's property. Why should there be defences for that? Why should there be a legal defence for criminal damage?
There's defences throughout for anything. So it's about just making sure that people are treated fairly, treated properly. You can't simply do anything you want and then say, oh, I've got a right to free speech. But that is a fundamental human right. What the court then has to do is to balance often your interference with other people's rights, so inconvenience to others, with your right to protest and assess whether or not it's proportionate to convict you. Many defendants, many activists would think that it doesn't give them a fair trial, doesn't give them a fair crack at it, really. And it really seems to be that protest is almost singled out in a way in terms of how defences are being restricted.
Hello, nice to meet you.
How do you do?
Good, thank you. Wow, this is an incredible house. I meet Lord Jonathan Sumption. He's a former justice to the Supreme Court and has a different perspective on what protesters should be able to rely on in court.
You should not be allowed to deploy defences in court that are completely irrelevant to the case. These excuses, namely that because you feel strongly you are entitled to cause people enormous disruption to their lives or destruction of their property, are legally irrelevant to the offence charged. And it seems to me to be perfectly legitimate for a judge to rule that you cannot waste the time of the court by running defences that are legally totally irrelevant.
So it's day 4 of the trial, it's Thursday, and it really feels like the tension and the emotions are starting to get really heightened. Dr. Clack has been giving her evidence this morning, and you can see her hand shaking as she was drinking water during the evidence, and at some point she broke down in tears. Over the next few days, the medics continue to give their evidence. In some recent protest cases, the judge hasn't allowed activists to explain their actions at all, forbidding them from talking about the climate crisis to the jury. And when some defendants disobeyed this order, they were sent to prison for 7 weeks for contempt of court. The medics are worried that they might be restricted in this way, but they're not. They're allowed to explain at length about their motivations and their concern for climate change. Okay, so that was really interesting. The Crown Prosecution Service barrister has been quizzing the medics under cross-examination, and he's been asking them about all these hypothetical scenarios. So, is it okay to smash your friend's window to convince them to recycle? Or would it be okay to steal a Rolex watch from a footballer just because he can afford it? And I can tell that the medics are finding this process of being cross-examined, of having to give evidence, really quite difficult. I catch consultant Alice as she comes out of the court. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm tired. Well, it's just saying how it is, really, isn't it? And sometimes that is difficult because it means, I don't know, reaching into our motivation for doing what we did, which is can be painful.
Where do you think the emotion's coming from?
Just sadness of the situation that we're in.
Yeah.
I'm going to go and have a drink now. Really stressful, really stressful.
Back at the house, Alice and Maggie tell me that they're feeling the pressure. Are you thinking as this is going on about the potential consequences for your professional life?
It's more real now, but we thought about it beforehand.
Yeah. If we do get a verdict of guilty, I honestly don't know. But I have thought very much about what the consequences are if I can't be a nurse anymore, if I am suspended for a period of time or are found unfit to practice. And there's economic repercussions of but also my identity, the job I love.
You're a great nurse.
Alice says I'm a great nurse.
Well, I have never been nursed by you, but knowing you, I am sure you're a great nurse.
Yeah, I do it with everything I've got.
We're going to leave Maggie and the others for a moment. I've come to Birmingham to meet another doctor activist, retired GP Sarah Benn. She was suspended by the General Medical Council after being jailed for demonstrating outside an oil terminal. Her case demonstrates a new way in which activists say their right to protest is being increasingly restricted.
I've been a very non-rebellious person for all my life up to that point, very conformist. I don't queue jump, I don't complain. It really never occurred to me. And when it did, it was a bit of a light bulb moment.
Like many of the other environmental activists I've met, Sarah has been on quite a journey, from self-confessed people pleaser to a committed climate activist.
Yeah, it's suddenly gone from being quite green and rural to looking very industrial.
Yep.
Kingsbury.
Yep, the scene of the crime.
We go with her to Kingsbury Oil Terminal, just east of Birmingham. She's been arrested multiple times for protesting here.
Right.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So this is where you were protesting?
Yeah, this little stretch here.
On the outside of the fence?
On the outside of the fence. And then that little entry road.
Right.
So I think, shall we cross?
Yeah.
So we We stood with our placards along this stretch, literally just facing towards the road. I had my placard which said "Stop New Oil."
She was arrested here because she broke an injunction. In simple terms, an injunction is a court order that stops someone from doing something. In this case, banning protesters from demonstrating on the grass verge next to the refinery and from sitting in the road to block tankers going into the site. The injunctions on this site were initially taken out by the oil company that operates the terminal, then later by the local council.
This is part of the injuncted area. So over there is okay,
Right.
but here is not.
After being arrested for the 5th time, Sarah was taken to court and jailed for 32 days for breaching the council injunction. Injunctions are part of the civil rather than criminal justice system, so if you're in court for breaking an injunction, there's no jury, just one judge who rules whether or not you breach the order. Lawyer Raj Chadha says the number of protest injunctions used over the last few years is unprecedented.
What has happened is both private companies, such as oil companies, and government bodies, such as National Highways or Transport for London, have taken out injunctions to prevent protests from happening.
So if you do end up in court for breaching the injunction, what's the process?
You are summoned to the High Court, and the only argument you can have then is whether you breached the injunction. So you're not allowed to argue, well, that injunction should never have been granted in the first place. If you're found to have breached the injunction, you can go to prison for 2 years and you can have costs against you.
File on 4 has discovered that corporations and public authorities are currently using 15 injunctions to ban non-violent environmental protests, like the one that you've just heard about at Kingsbury Oil Terminal. They cover over 1,200 locations across the UK. More than half were taken out by oil companies such as Shell, Esso and ExxonMobil, restricting protests around oil terminals, HQs or petrol stations. Shell told us that the purpose of the injunctions is not to restrict peaceful protest, but to prevent unlawful and dangerous protests and to act as a deterrent. Esso and ExxonMobil declined to comment. A smaller proportion of the injunctions were taken out by public bodies like National Highways and Transport for London. National Highways said it couldn't comment because of the election, and TfL said the injunctions ensure London's road network can operate safely. The injunctions apply to upwards of 400 named individuals, from groups such as Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, but also extend to persons unknown, meaning anyone can fall foul of these orders. If you're one of the people named, you can technically challenge the injunction in a civil court. But if you lose, you'll become liable for the legal costs, not just for yourself, but also for the organisation that took out the injunction. And many of them hire expensive corporate lawyers.
So it's practically not possible for these injunctions to be challenged by ordinary citizens.
How big could the cost be at that early stage?
I think that where you would get up to £400,000 or £500,000.
£400,000 or £500,000?
Yeah, you're talking huge sums of money. Huge sums of money. If you don't have that money, that injunction then remains out against you. And then if you breach it by protesting, by walking down a street, you can go to prison. It is a privatised system of justice.
Doesn't feel like an official way to present documents.
That one's falling apart.
They're all sort of in like slightly disintegrating plastic folders.
In front of Kingsbury Oil Terminal with Sarah, we find something quite bizarre. When an injunction is served, it has to be made publicly available.
So that's like a big plastic storage box that you might use to store stuff under your bed or something. And it's got a sign on the front saying High Court Injunction.
This is here to inform potential protesters that there's an injunction in place here.
And inside it, we're just opening it, it's basically just loads and loads of files, different injunctions in them.
Oh, lordy. That's been in there for a while.
Oh,
it's nice and mouldy.
It's very mouldy. And at the bottom is a kind of...
a pool of water.
Yeah.
Make of that what you will.
I'm not sure anyone other than us would wade through this box of mouldy documents, but there's also a sign on the fence which summarises the terms of the injunction.
I think my simplistic interpretation is quite correct, which is you're not allowed to protest here, and if you do, they can arrest you and send you to prison and fine you and seize your assets. So far they've sent me to prison. That's what it all boils down to.
There have been multiple injunctions obtained for this site by oil companies, but the most recent one was taken out by North Warwickshire Council. It's one of the smallest district councils in the country, but our Freedom of Information requests show that it spent £158,000 on legal fees to get the order in place. 51 people have spent time in prison on remand for refusing to comply with the council's injunction, and 10 people, including Sarah, have been given custodial sentences. We asked North Warwickshire Borough Council for a response, but they couldn't comment due to the election and ongoing court proceedings. The injunction at this site has worked, and there are no more protests outside the oil terminal.
They're taking out injunctions because they think that that will help to deter people.
Lord Sumption again.
If you obtain an injunction to protect your property, you are entitled to proceed against people who break it for contempt of court. So you have a remedy in your own hands. But the reason why people ask for injunctions is so that they can themselves pursue the people who break them instead of being dependent on the police and prosecuting authorities.
But shouldn't they depend on the police and prosecuting authorities? Isn't that the point of the criminal justice system?
If somebody, it is the point of the criminal justice system, but we also have a civil justice system.
As we walk back to the car, I ask Sarah about the tactics of the environmental movement, which often risk breaching injunctions or breaking the law.
But I mean, if everybody in small groups took it upon themselves to break the law in order to
get what they want.
Exactly. Wouldn't we live in quite a chaotic society?
Absolutely. But I do think this is a special case. And yes, everybody thinks they're special, don't they? But I really wish people could and would understand that we really are in an emergency situation. We really are trying to sound a desperate alarm.
After Sarah was released from prison, she faced more consequences. She was suspended by the General Medical Council, and a decision is pending as to whether she'll be struck off. The GMC told us that where doctors have broken the law, they have to consider whether their conduct could bring the profession into disrepute or damage public confidence. This is what the medics may have in store for them if they're found guilty. It's day 8 of the trial. The jury have just been sent out for deliberation. There are lots of activists waiting around here in the courthouse for a verdict. There are some people playing Scrabble, some people practicing handstands. I've even seen some Tai Chi. The expectation here is that they will return a verdict really quite quickly. The judge was very clear in his directions that the jury must apply the law, so no one's feeling very optimistic. Do any of you have any feelings about what you think the verdict will be?
Given up trying. I think we'll be found guilty.
I sadly agree with Juliet.
Oh, one more sleep to go, people. One more sleep to go. That is quite a nice feeling.
With no legal defences, the medics are hoping the jury acquit them based on their conscience, because they sympathise with their motivations.
I think the thing about having just one more sleep, though, is then it's down to the jury.
Yeah,
you know,
we've done our
after
part.
one more sleep.
Have they said enough to convince the jury that no matter what the law says, the urgency of the climate crisis has compelled them to act in the way that they did? When I was in the court before, I was looking over at the jury and, we know that a lot of people don't support disruptive protests. And now these protesters are having to convince the jury to acquit them. And I'm just wondering whether these tactics are going to backfire a bit. I asked GP Pat about this. The kind of tactics that the environmental movement uses, you're disrupting the public, you're disrupting people's lives, people don't like it. What do you think gives you the right to do that?
Yeah, I don't describe it as a right, really. I describe it as a necessity. I have lived my life so far generally in a way that's as considerate as possible to the needs and desires of others. The reason I justify to myself disruption, which is very annoying for people, is because this is an existential issue. We're talking about the collapse of human civilization.
With protests that are disrupting the public, they're not targeting the right people. They're targeting the people who are not responsible for climate change and people who actually need to get on side.
Yeah, I guess targeting, we have really tried within the climate movement to target the folks most responsible. We had a whole campaign at the beginning of 2022 specifically looking at the oil industry, and what we learned is it's much, much easier to ignore. And it was in many ways a really successful campaign, but it was very easy for the media and the public to ignore. And that, I think, is probably why there was a pivot back towards more public-facing disruption, because it's impossible to ignore.
But these kind of protests are becoming more difficult. Independent government advisor Lord Walney wants more restrictions on groups that routinely break the law. And he believes that some environmental activists represent a potential terror threat.
It is a dangerous ladder of potential extremism, because if you accept the idea that it's okay or justifiable to break the law in favour of particular causes, where does that stop? When you look at the actions of violent terrorists, for example, militants across history, across a range of causes, they always believe they're the good guys. They believe that their cause is so overwhelmingly justified that often not only is there an excuse to carry out extreme violent acts, there's actually a responsibility.
Is there an example of a violent or an extreme act from the environmental movement? Are there some examples that you have?
What would you say? There have been examples in other countries of environmental terrorism. They have been isolated,
but not here.
But not here largely, which is a really good thing.
It sounds like you want to bring in measures to stop groups doing something that they haven't actually done.
You have seen violent action on behalf of the climate in other areas. There is thinking within the climate movement from some that you just have to keep doing more and more until you actually get the result that you want.
If we fast forward to, say, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, when we'll be starting to see some of the worst effects of climate change, when people are looking back, how do you think they're going to see this movement, and how do you think they're going to see the debate about the tactics that they're using?
I think that tactics which get across the urgency of the situation and use creative channels to do that, absolutely important. But I think if you look back on what can drive change, I think there is no substitute for genuinely being able to engage in public opinion.
Where there's evidence, there's absolutely no evidence for that. The people involved in the climate movement are the most committed to a peaceful way of life that I think I've ever met. In this trial, we're a group of 4 doctors and 2 nurses. He thinks we're going to suddenly become extremist.
Hi Joe, so this morning I think we're just feeling quite calm. We've all had breakfast. Toast and Marmite seems to be the thing for this morning. Nothing exciting happening here, which is a good thing, because the adrenaline up and down is not easy.
It's day 10 of the trial. Again, we expect a verdict in the morning, but it's not until after 3 p.m. that the judge brings the jury back into the courtroom.
I can't believe it, honestly. We were so sure it was going to be guilty at lunchtime.
I don't think I was.
You said.
After more than 2 days of deliberation, the jurors have been unable to agree. It's a hung jury, which means that the medics have been found neither guilty nor innocent. In a case where they had no legal defences, the medics are amazed at this outcome.
The jury were even more amazing than we realised. Yeah, we're so in awe of them, aren't we?
So brave, so really brave and so thoughtful. Really took it all in.
The thing that touched me most was the good luck from from one of the jurors as he left. That really touched me.
So he said good luck to you as he left.
Yeah.
They couldn't have made it any harder for us. They took away everything we had and tried to make it about points of law only. And the fact is, there still must be people in that jury exercising their conscience.
Lawyer Raj Chadha believes what he sees as the hardening of the criminal justice system towards disruptive protesters poses a threat to democracy.
We have the most draconian anti-protest laws in over a century. It is so far removed from where we were 4 years ago. Protest has been regarded as the lifeblood of democracy. But protest is becoming harder and harder. And you would say that democracy might be facing a heart attack.
I think it's a threat to democracy when people say, well, if we can't persuade people, then we're going to disrupt their lives until they submit. That seems to me to be the real threat to democracy.
The Medics case isn't over yet. The Crown Prosecution Service has made the decision to prosecute again. Although, because of the backlog in the court system, the retrial won't be until 2026.
What are you all going to do now?
We're going to go for a drink, Joe. Going for a drink. Yeah, I think that's the first port of call.
Really
and
back to work on Monday.
Back to work on, yeah.
This File on 4 podcast was presented by me, Josephine Casserly, and produced by Tom Wall. The technical producer was Richard Hannaford and the production coordinator was Tim Fernley. The editor was Carl Johnston. And it was a BBC long-form audio production for BBC Sounds.